this genius legal structure that's been built on. But it all boils down to that foundation that is so simple.
You gave the beautiful examples. We need to understand the principles behind the Constitution so we can advocate for them. It will cut through the fog.
Hey folks, welcome to Liberty Empowered Media, where we empower you with the principles of liberty. We're excited for tonight. We have Cari, Bartholomew, and Enoch Moore. We'll start out by asking some very important things about the education system from you, Cari, and we'll have some comments from the whole group as we go along. So Cari, you wanted to discuss what you said is communism in the education system. What an absurd statement.
Nice.
You are claiming, now you're not speaking in hyperbole here, I assume.
Sure.
You are literally asserting that there is communism in our education system?
So I would have went backwards and ended up at that point, but yes, I would agree. What's happening is a huge focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what you have to understand is that equity means equal outcomes. When you all have equal outcomes and nobody can achieve more, then what do you get?
Socialism.
You get socialism. And when you have no choice in the matter, you get communism.
Yeah.
So, and I think right now a lot of people on the left would say that we do have choices in the matter, but I can show you that that's actually not the case. And it's really shocking because I moved here from Washington State thinking that I was going to seek refuge in Utah. I very much expected this to be the place where my family could go off to school and I could go back to being...
You don't have to deal with CHOP.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, no CHOP, no Antifa, no BLM. So all of those things are things that I was hoping to avoid. And then I got here, and the first thing that I saw was the governor not saying no to a CRT bill. His exact words were, well, we're not going to allow people to teach oppressor and oppressive, but we do want to teach real history. But CRT isn't real history. I call CRT critical resentment theory. And I think it's probably the most abusive thing that we can do to our children.
So by focusing so much on this oppressor versus oppressed mentality in the classroom, what is that doing to their education? And as a black woman, what do you think, specifically from a black individual's perspective, does that do to black youth?
So I want to clarify first, because there are some people who will say I'm not black enough to speak for all black people. So I'm biracial, and to me, if you cut an apple in half, you get two sides, right? And so I'm concerned about what it's doing to all children. But what it's doing to black children is it's perpetuating something that's been happening since about the 1930s, when they started destroying the family, and they started telling these kids who were very capable. And we did not know this. I did not know this growing up. I thought academics were for white people, because that's basically what I was taught. I thought that if you were black and you achieved, you were a musician or you were an athlete. That's what I thought growing up. And suddenly I find out about things like Black Wall Street. I find out about the Jack and Jill societies. I find out that there have been wealthy black people, successful black people for multiple generations, and we don't hear those stories.
The first female millionaire
Yes.
was a black woman.
Absolutely. And even right now, we have a lieutenant governor who is a black woman who nobody talks about. And you would think that that would be something that would be in front of children's faces. Because we know that when Barack Obama was in office, that was in front of everyone's face. But right now, we have Winsome Sears. and very few people know who she even is. So, and she's the lieutenant governor of Virginia. So I think that it's really important that our kids have an education that is steeped in, the thing that I do is I talk about ethnic studies, okay? The ultimate goal of ethnic studies, just like social and emotional learning, is to turn your children into activists. I have a slide, if you would, the matrix of social identity and intersectional power. These are all of the different ways that a child would get this, and they would circle why they are oppressed, what places they have power in, what places they don't. They're taught to feel guilty.
So this is a manipulative Marxism.
Yes.
Because discovering you are a victim, you are being oppressed, and therefore there must be the equity that you talked about,
yes,
which comes then traditionally from Marxism.
For African Americans specifically, in Utah, the proficiency rate in just reading is 16%. Oh. And math is not much better than that. So people will sit and go, oh, those poor people, I feel so bad for them. But you need to understand that's the equity piece. And that equity piece means that instead of lifting them up, we lower the standard for everyone else. Right. Literally, Christine Sleeter, who is behind designing ethnic studies, says it's a double helix. The children must first learn their level of oppression. Then they need to take their power back to dismantle the systems, which is dismantling Western civilization.
That's right.
And that brings us back to your, how is this communistic in our school? Because 2 years ago, I would have been like, you guys are insane. I don't even know. Schools are wonderful. Nothing. Today, I feel very differently about it as I watch these things. Will you go to that first slide? The red one?
Teaching when the world is on fire.
Yes. So when I first got here, I wanted to know what the schools were like because I'm a very proactive parent. And so I decided to be a substitute teacher. So I went into the schools and I give it my all, down to the point of if I'm working in an elementary school, I put butterflies in my hair and I'm like the magic fairy when I go into class. And we were in the classroom and they were reading Tom Sawyer. This is 11th grade kids.
11th grade, wow.
Tom Sawyer, 11th grade, and they're not reading it. They are listening to an audiobook of it, and then they're answering 5 questions. And I don't know if it was because I was in the room, but they didn't want to say the N-word. And I don't believe our kids should live in a place of fear, which is another factor to the communism, kind of that censorship, the self-censorship, where you are afraid to stand out, you are afraid to stand up.
I was a teacher before all this happened many years ago, and I was able to do that and comment on the different things that the kids brought. And this was an extremely rural community, and we had one student who insisted that he wanted to ride his horse to school. And they wouldn't let him because we don't have any place to keep the horse here, He was trying to find somebody local where he could keep the horse, and he didn't give up. But I didn't ever, my approach was just to listen to him.
Yes.
And have him tell their stories, have him talk to people about his horse. Why does he like his horse? That's all I did.
Yes.
And it worked great.
You made the kid feel like they mattered.
Yeah.
Now what we're doing is making their identity matter. The reason I pulled up this one is I was in a classroom in an elementary school, and a teacher had 3 books on her desk. So this one was Teaching When the World is on Fire, and it was specifically about how to bring politics into the K-12 classroom when you're not supposed to.
The school system is what perpetuates racism, actually. Kids are born colorblind and not knowing the difference until they're taught it.
Yes.
Until they're taught they're oppressed, and then that perpetuates the very problem that they think they have to solve as they grow up.
Yes. And I will see children so what happened here is I was fired because I took this picture and 2 other pictures. In the classroom, I never showed a kid. I did it during lunch. Nobody saw what I did, but because I posted it and I said, sub today, don't ask me where, I was deemed a conflict of interest. And because I think it's wrong to teach with race in mind on these kids,
Right.
I'm a conflict of interest. And people need to realize that our kids are told one narrative, they're told to go out and stand. The goal is not to stabilize. The goal is to turn these kids into activists by whatever means possible. So you have, basically, African Americans have been the guinea pigs for about 40 years.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? They have been taught that academics are stupid. They have been taught to rely on their friend groups more than their family. Everything they've been taught is now coming to our schools through GSA and whatever other kind of clubs, whatever other identities. So this is not about being kind, being an ally, which I hate that word because it comes from communism. It's not about that. It's about turning our children into activists so they will burn down and destroy our systems. And ultimately, the system that they want to destroy is Western civilization.
Correct.
Flyer
There you go.
for the gala. We do want to announce that real quick. So on December 9th, we've got a Christmas gala. We have nationally recognized Constitution scholar Scott Bradley that's going to present how the Christian principles in the legal framework of the Constitution is the solution. The Constitution's our solution. So he'll present on that. And we are especially excited that we've got award-winning Broadway singer Dallin Bayless that's going to treat us that evening. Get your tickets right now at utahliberty.net. We're trying really hard with Broadway entertainment and a catered meal to keep the price low for you. But there will be a price increase after the 17th of November. But I just want to tell you about that. And thank you so much for tuning in. The public education system is absolutely being used as a vehicle driver for Marxism.
Yes.
Whether it be socialism, identity politics, communism, or even fascism. Karl Marx actually, many of the listeners may be familiar with the Communist Manifesto. So he summed up the manifesto in 10 points. The 10 planks is what he called it. And one of the key ones was state-funded and state-controlled education.
Yeah.
Right.
He knew that you control, if the state controls education, you control the narrative, you indoctrinate. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. When I had reached out to Enoch, who's been on our radar to invite on the show, which reached out and asked you something that you felt was important to bring up. And you said that you feel like the biggest creeping issue we have is becoming a fascist state. Now, I mentioned fascism is connected with Marxism. A lot of the mainstream is going to say fascism is the political right. In actuality, it belongs on the left. But I don't even like the left-right paradigm.
Right.
I don't even like left-right.
Correct.
You have tyranny and you have liberty.
Left and right is actually another communist principle. Us getting stuck in that mindset, am I on the left or am I on the right? Well, you're now a victim of communism if you're even wondering.
There you go.
Well, there's a great video called Overview of America that the John Birch Society did that clarifies this very clearly. The political spectrum is really more about 0% government on the left, 100% government on the right. And so the more government you have, the more tyrannical you get. The less government you have, some people would argue the more free you are, but the founders knew a tiny bit of government on that spectrum. Just a little bit was the perfect balance of protecting rights and freedoms without going all the way to the right. So because of the misunderstanding of fascism being on the right, some people say, oh, well then Hitler is the perfect fascist and he was the super conservative, but the most racist, and conservatives are racist, and there's all these incorrect preconceived notions, but really, Hitler, the real reason he was fascist was because even though he wasn't total communist, he wasn't one guy, one corporation controlling everything. He meddled in the free market and then took control of the free market. So by telling all the businesses and various institutions what to do, even though they were kind of in control, so like if you owned your business but the government tells you how to run it, that's fascism. The government wants to control our individual lives while pretending we own our lives is fascism, which means they're in control. It's closer to 100%. Right?
We're plugged into a matrix where we get the appearance that there's a free market.
Right, correct. And there is a level where there has to be some free market, otherwise we'd collapse. A total control is what the Soviet Union was, and it didn't work, right? So the communists of the world learned through all their experiments over the last few centuries what works and what doesn't work. So they realize we have to allow the free market to a certain degree. And that actually generates wealth, but then they want to control that wealth. Yeah.
We do have BlackRock, which
Right.
owns, I can't remember the exact percentages, it's like 20% of literally everything. Because what they do is they take over businesses and then they redistribute them. And therefore, there's a certain amount of the regular business that's going on for that. But they, for the most part, control it, which they're to try to discover how the government is dealing directly with BlackRock, it's very difficult to do.
And that's the key, right? Imagine the Soviet Union, or imagine a communist state where nobody was allowed to own businesses. What you really have is not a lack of corporations, you have one giant corporation, right? You need to see it that way. And so what if you have 100 corporations at the top kind of working together? The key is when you take those corporations and you mix government power with that. So you take government power, government money, and you blend it into those corporations. Now you're creating a communist state. And that's why the founders actually emphasize that we have to be a republican form of government, which actually makes this model illegal fundamentally. And this is kind of what's key to understand, right? What is a republican form of government? In the Federalist Papers, which is when the founders explained what they meant by the words in the Constitution, this should be basic reading for every politician as soon as they get in office. They talk about a republican form of government, which it's a requirement by law that we maintain ourselves in such form. Okay, so in order to comply with that law, as a government official, you have to know what those words mean. And kind of the gist of it is that the great body of power rests on the people first, not the government, and we delegate our authority to our representatives to act. And another piece of that they describe is that we cannot concentrate power in any special class of people. And so as soon as government starts giving its money to private institutions, you are changing our form of government. Right?
Isn't that like the World Economic Forum?
Correct.
Because
that's exactly where I'm going.
Okay.
Correct.
Sorry.
Right? Yeah. In fact, so this is kind of high level, but you'll find it matters to what you're talking about. And it matters to people that worry about property rights. And it matters to people in every issue. Okay? If government stayed out of the private sector, this would be a very different ballgame.
Right.
Right? Who is controlling the levels of education? You talked about the National Education Association. All these associations that call themselves public-private partnerships.
So dangerous.
That's intentional. Yeah, go ahead.
So we have another part of the whole mess that's going on in our schools is social and emotional learning. And social and emotional learning is really social and emotional compliance. It teaches your child how to behave correctly. And the people who fund this are Bill and Melinda Gates and the Zuckerberg Chan Foundation. So they're teaching our children the correct way to behave. And if you don't agree with it, then you're that oppressor.
Now, Cari,
Yes.
when I finished, one of the main things that I had a challenge with in teaching was what you've used the word teaching, But what you've described is training. And I then, after I quit and moved, I was in California for a while, then I came to Utah, and this is over 10 years ago. I gave a speech on this and said, using the history of Pavlov's dogs, when teachers become trainers, students become dogs. When the Common Core situation was beginning to be implemented, was that students were not allowed to ask questions.
Right.
And of course, when we really look at the foundation of the principle of true Republican form of government, if you can't ask a question,
Right.
nobody can learn anything.
Students are trained to just receive.
Which is the only way they're going to be obedient enough to follow the things. Because when they know they have liberty, when they know what freedom is, they're not
Right.
going to follow that. It's like, you want to do what?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that wholeheartedly. And so consider in the beginning of the Common Core battle, there's still in place today federal law that says you cannot create a national curriculum. And if you go back even further, you can't even have a Department of Education. There's no enumerated power for it. So we're already unconstitutional right there. But when there was pushback initially of you can't nationalize our curriculum, it's federal law, they said, well, so the excuse the establishment used was, oh, it's not coming from the federal government. It's coming from the National Governors Association. And they're just a bunch of private governors that hang out and talk about good ideas. Okay, and so you have to see government here, private institutions here, they create this middle ground, okay, where they have these, they'll have it both ways. They want their cake and they'll eat it too. Well, sometimes they'll say we're private, so we're not government, so we can tell everybody what to do and standardize. And then in other cases, they'll say, oh, actually, we have the force of law, so you have to do what we say. So when they start to mix private economics with government power, that's when you get fascism. And right now, this is the foundation of everything happening in our state, in our country, in the world, as you started to bring up. They are destroying our form of government by creating public-private infrastructure. We have probably, okay, let's go to this. The state of Utah actually has a program to create public-private partnerships, to go out and mingle with the business community, mingle with the nonprofit community, and say, let us give you money.
Sounds like such a positive thing.
Right. That's the reaction, right?
You have the state going out and creating these positive partnerships.
Right. And so that would be the initial excuse people would think before they really think about the principle, the underlying principle behind there. People don't understand that the Republican form of government issue. So it is actually in our state constitution about half dozen times to fundamentally restrict these from being created. We have a free market clause in our state constitution, which says a free market must be the rule of commerce in our state.
Right.
And when you break that down to the nitty-gritty, this is what it's going after, is these public-private partnerships are a violation of that. These public-private partnerships create a special class of people who are in power, which is restricted by a Republican form of government. When you and your friends can get together and say, the governor is, giving us $10 million, you now have more power than a free market solution to address the same problem. So by crossing those borders, those barriers between public and private, we create a special class. Okay, and what the Federalist Papers say is that as soon as we acknowledge that we are no longer Republican in form, our government is no longer defensible to even exist.
These are the dangers, Jake, that we're involved with that's like a tsunami coming on us with the colleges and the schools and stuff. But the core of salvation from this is the fact that you cannot change an individual from liberty. You can't separate liberty from an individual. There are some statements
with the individual.
Yeah, it actually starts with the individual, which then was clarified to a certain degree, well, actually pretty powerfully in the Declaration of Independence.
It claims it from God.
Correct.
Right?
That's how they say it.
And that's kind of the foundation of solving all these problems, is understanding what our rights are individually and starting to claim them, starting to use our words. Our words are very powerful. Just like the words are being used to oppress people, to tell someone you are oppressed. When people believe those words, that is the reality they will act out until they start to understand, wait a minute, actually, God gave me a lot of power. And they start to think, how much power do I actually have? And who's really oppressing me, right? And it takes time to, think through those, but...
As you mentioned, Cari, I mean, you're more specifically talking about schools, but the progression of the school system, whatever, but the businesses is also being difficult. What do we see being built right now? Okay, for the most part, we see a bunch of these big buildings that are going to house a whole bunch of people. Okay? Well,
Stacking packs.
how is that? I'm a general contractor. Okay, now in since I left teaching, I've been a general contractor.
Yeah.
So I look at this, and as a small contractor, as an independent contractor, I need to get various types of work. Gets to build these big buildings. These are companies that are owned, for the most part, outside Utah.
Seems like they're often related to politicians.
That's where I'm going with this. The connection that then the politicians of Utah
Some politician's son.
reach out to these companies, but they also reach out to other countries.
Yeah.
And China is a big deal. I mean,
Right.
the relationship between Utah business and China business is a big deal.
Like what you're describing is this new infrastructure,
Correct.
which is coming from the ideas of the World Economic Forum. Around the world, it's happening very similarly everywhere. But that infrastructure would be impossible to be built without the fascist system, the political fascist system that they've built up. Think of the private builders. You as a contractor, you can't build something if no one's going to pay for it.
Correct.
And so when you build something in the free market, you say, what do the people want? What's the demand? And it's like, oh, people want single-family homes, people want apartments by colleges, people want, whatever it is. There is no natural demand for these high-density stack and pack buildings.
It's being forced.
Zero,
Yeah.
right?
Zero.
City councils and even county governments, they have some type of limit on the number of permits for building that they can give out. And so because we're limited, we're projecting that we're going to have X number of growth in the population, what makes the most sense? Let's give it to this big contractor because they're able to, they have the means to be able to pull off a massive project, and we've got to condense the housing because of this. It's all orchestrated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little towns in Utah where what happens is these public-private partnerships come into these little towns, and they kind of, like there's the League of Cities and Towns, they're quasi-government, half private organization, and there's dozens to hundreds of these in every state, and right, the community never wants it. So what power does the community have to stop it? And my argument is leveraging the Constitution by identifying how they're actually violating the Constitution to bring these things in, by identifying the public-private money that's coming in there, and half a dozen other places in the Constitution, that I could point out to someone. And the cities tend to feel bullied by the state. Like there's a new law passed, something that said 20% of cities have to be high density by a certain time, right? And so then they say, well, gosh, we have to follow the law, and cities start to feel powerless. Well, the law says this, right? It's the job of the cities to know when the legislature has gone outside their bounds, and for them to say, this is unconstitutional, here's why, and we're going to honor our oath and say, we're not building that in our community. You can identify that, and the specifics matter in every situation for exactly how they would do that. But the Constitution is a restraint on government power, but it's also empowering officials against other people that are crossing the boundaries.
I love this. I have so many friends that they'll call me up because they're like, Jake, you're Mr. Constitution guy. They want to make some kind of case against something, and they're like, I've spent hours trying to research code. I'm like, you don't need to spend hours looking at code. The supreme law is right here, the Constitution. And I said, we have been so trained over the many decades to overcomplicate it.
Right.
It is literally, and look, when I ran for office, I even, as a constitutionalist, fell into this discovered I was falling into this trap, because I said, I'm going to find something in the state constitution that prohibits this or that with our voting. And I started thumbing through it, and I went, oh, dang it. And then I was like, wait a second. I don't need to find a clause that says they don't get to do something. They don't operate on negative assumption of power. They operate on a positive delegation of authority.
That's what they do.
So if it is not enumerated, they don't get to do it, period. It is that simple. And so when you look at the list of enumerated powers in the United States Constitution, you can do the same with our state constitution. But the list of powers is so small, they literally do not get to do it if it is not enumerated. And so one of the things I like to do with large groups when I speak to a group is I say, heaven forbid, Congress repeals the Second Amendment tomorrow. What happens to your gun rights? Not are you going to give up your guns, or should you give up your guns? That's a whole other argument. But legally speaking, what happens to your gun rights? Oh, well, there goes our gun rights. We can't let the Second Amendment be repealed. I said, so you're telling me that an amendment gives you your God-given rights? No. Show me a clause in the Constitution that enumerates authority for the federal government to come take your guns. It's not in there. We get so caught up in the semantics of, well, what does a well-regulated militia mean? And we kind of get so tunnel-visioned on these semantics that are meant to trap us, when at the end of the day, is there enumerated authority for the federal government to do something? No. And you mentioned the state constitution. The same thing with our state constitution. And cities, I had someone tell me, well, it's not the same relationship as cities to state as state is to federal government. I said, sure it is. Because all of us have the ability to stand up for what is stated in the legal compact of the Constitution. It is absolutely a legal binding compact.
Yeah, and I know why people say that, and it's not exactly the same, but your point is valid that the city is not okay, I'll qualify and clarify this. The city isn't completely, just a minion of the state, right? Mm-hmm. The city is an extension of the state.
Well, that's because of the corporation of Utah creating the corporation of each individual county and state.
Sure, which...
Tooele is not in the corporation. Tooele is...
So a city doesn't have the same sovereignty that a state has from the federal government.
Right.
However, it is still the local level where the people are the source of all authority.
Right, and I want to emphasize your point because I want to help people understand why. I want to help people get around this argument.
Right.
Okay, when they say the city has to obey, because city councils will do this all the time. Oh my gosh, the governor called us, even when they want to do the right thing, they will cave. I think there are some decent people, especially in a lot of the rural areas, that would love to thumb their nose at the state, but they think they have to obey certain things. Right. Now, there are some things they do have to obey, but so there are two different tracks of power. So if we can kind of imagine this, okay, as I describe it, in a Republican form of government, all the power starts with us, the people, right? We then delegate the powers we want to delegate to the state. Where did we delegate that power? We wrote down what power we gave them a long time ago in something called the Constitution. That's the power we gave them. It was ours originally. We said, okay, we want a government to exist, so here you go, government. We create this thing, but here's your, your job description. So now we gave them those specific powers, like you were saying.
Right.
So they should act out in their authority in those powers. If they did it correctly, we would have more freedoms. Okay, so now let's take that a little bit further. The state then says, with the power the people gave us, we're going to empower this city, we're going to empower this city, right? So within the bounds of the correct enumerated authority given, the cities should obey. But the cities did not just inherit the powers of the state, they also inherited the limitations of the state. Okay, and that's kind of what's key. So when the state decides to say to the cities, you have to do this, the cities can say, that goes outside the boundaries. We legally can't do what you're telling us. In fact, I was bound by oath or affirmation to the people's voice. Okay, so you see the line goes back to the people. That empowers the city councilman to say no to the state. And so there's two tracks of power where they inherited the properly enumerated powers, and so they'll obey the state when the state is acting correctly, and they can ignore and say no to the city, or I mean to the state.
Yeah.
When they go outside the bounds.
Right.
I hope that the audience here is getting a bit excited, and you guys need to send stuff in on either Liberty United or stuff about what's going on with Liberty Empowered Media, because we're doing these issues. So if you've got ideas, send them our way.
Yeah. Our state constitution. So my favorite clause in the United States Constitution is the 9th Amendment. How many times have you heard the argument? Well, the Constitution's open for interpretation.
Right.
Okay. I say, okay, who interprets it, and how is it supposed to be interpreted? The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So nothing could be done in any way, or even interpreted. Nothing could be done in a way that's going to so much as disparage the rights of the people. Our state constitution takes that further, though. It has a very similar clause, very similar verbiage. I was trying to look it up.
127, Article 1, Section 27.
Yeah, it says impair, right?
I'm not sure if we're thinking the same thing.
Things we're talking about. I'd love to identify specific things in the Constitution that protect us.
Yeah.
One of those is the Just Compensation Clause. Last line of the Fifth Amendment. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The example often thought of is eminent domain. Okay, if we look at eminent domain and then we apply that same principle to other aspects of property. Now think of what property is. Anything that you have worked to acquire. Okay, now with looking at eminent domain, if the government comes in and says, hey, we need to take your house and your property, this land here, to build a road for infrastructure, you wouldn't walk away simply saying, oh, well, my payment is the infrastructure for the community. Oh, hell no. You're going to expect fair and just compensation. So why are we allowing government to come in and take from us in other means without just compensation? And we just justify it because they're providing us an infrastructure.
Right.
That's not how it works.
Right.
So it all comes back to the idea of all power is inherent and comes from the people.
Right.
If I don't have the right to do something myself, I can't delegate that authority to government if I don't even have that right to begin with. So,
Yep.
Cari, I don't have the right to come and steal from you. I don't have that right. Now, I could use my freedom and my agency to do that, but it's not a right.
Right.
So I don't have the authority to delegate something that I'm not authorized to do. How could I delegate that?
Right. The founders taught that very clearly in their writings.
So I have a question, and I'm afraid of where this is going to head, but we have a large section of the government and people who have literally no respect for the Constitution. no respect for the values. And so we can say these things, but if they believe that the Constitution is outdated and should be torn down, and that just comes back to what I'm saying about schools, that people need to realize is that's what kids are being taught. They're being taught that our Constitution is outdated
Yeah,
and it shouldn't exist.
and I don't believe that they're teaching the kids this. I don't think that there's not any teaching going on. They're being told and informed,
Okay, yes.
and it's a declarative thing that 2 and 2 actually isn't necessarily 4.
Right.
Okay?
But
and the point is, this thing that we have called the Constitution, it's a cartoon.
Right.
It doesn't really exist. I mean, they just flat out say it's, if it ever anybody brings it up, they either avoid responding to it because it just doesn't exist, so
Right.
it's not a responsible thing.
So what's the solution, though?
So yeah, I want
There
to
you
Yeah.
go.
clarify that. So when you say it doesn't exist, okay, this is important to understand. It exists the moment you start advocating for it and speaking on behalf of it. That is nature's law. Okay?
Yes.
So
Yes.
the laws of nature are on our side. Again, I talked about words being so powerful, right? When a crowd of 1,000 people show up at a city council meeting and say, this is against the law, the Constitution, we're not going to allow you to do this, there's pressure, there's a problem now they have to deal with,
Yes.
Yes.
right? And so the goal of what you're talking about, okay, is not so much if you tell a bunch of high schoolers the Constitution doesn't matter, and now it doesn't matter anymore for the city or for the state. It's indirect. By making them not care about it and believe in it, then fewer and fewer people are going to show up demanding their rights, right? So when you counter-educate, did you know you have a right to free speech? Oh, Black Lives Matter kids will care about that.
Right.
Did you know you have a right to defend yourself? And really, well, I'm oppressed, and step by step, they'll start to get out of
Right.
the indoctrination because they're going to want those rights. And then they start to realize, oh my gosh, that document defends my rights. I have power when I believe in it and I stand on it. Whether you can say the Constitution is dead as soon as we stop speaking on its behalf.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power, and I'd build on that and say language, like you said.
Totally.
Something comes to mind. Just recently heard about how the word blue, whether in English language or some other language, a specific word to identify the color blue is actually a more modern thing. And with that, there's a tribe in Africa, I believe the Himba people, I might be butchering their name, but some English scientists went and did an experiment where they showed them this wheel of all sorts of different shades of green mixed with shades of blue, and they don't have a word in their language to identify blue. And so blue was just a different shade of green to them. They could not even comprehend blue as a different color. It's just a different shade of green because there's not a way to articulate that in their language. It's the same in Russian. Russian has since added a word for blue. But a long time ago, it wasn't the case. Blue's a more modern sense that Western culture has created ways to articulate that shade. But because there was not a word for it and a way to articulate that, blue didn't exist in their mind. And so we have got to create and break it down and explain and give the words necessary to people. What I would do is, I love, are you familiar with Shane Krauser? So he's a constitutional scholar. I've actually invited him, he's from Arizona. I've invited him to come to Utah twice now. And I love how simple he breaks this down. He used to teach constitutional law in the university. And he said that he was teaching predominantly during the Obama years. And in law school, he'd have many, many progressive Obama supporters college age, coming into his class. And he said, not once did I get any student oppose these fundamental ideas.
One. Yeah, go ahead, one. Let me count them. Do it. There's three here.
One.
I'm just going to one. Yeah.
Should you be able to keep what you work for? No, don't. Let's not get into the weeds on. Well, it depends on if you're rich or you're poor. I'm talking about you. Should you be able to keep what you work for? Number two, should the government follow the rules? We're not debating what the rules are, who interprets the rules, whatever, or what the rules should be. But if there's rules, should the government follow the rules? And you know, just these simple ideas that are so basic.
Yeah.
They're
powerful.
It should be like, well, no, duh. But we have just been so propagandized to move so far away from these fundamentals that the Constitution really does boil down. It's sure, you have this legal structure, this genius legal structure that's been built on, but it all boils down to that foundation that is so simple.
Absolutely. The principles are how you get past the left-right nonsense. That's how you reach people, is by, you gave the beautiful examples. I love that, you know, I can imagine that classroom and those students losing their minds and then loving it, right? Oh yeah, right? We need to understand the principles behind the Constitution so we can advocate for them, and it will cut through the fog. The Founding Fathers wrote his dictionary because he didn't want tyrants to change the meaning of the words in the Constitution. Communism in schools is slowly trying to change the meaning of words, and they have changed the meaning of many words, right, over time. So sometimes you go back to the original meaning of the words, 1828. Oh, it's fascinating what's in that dictionary. It's not some boring dictionary. The things I pull up, I'm like, oh, now that I see that definition, it makes total sense what this was originally intended to mean. Words have meaning in the Constitution. They can only mean what they were meant to mean in the day they were written. And we have amazing essays describing what was meant in the Federalist Papers. We, as a people, have to study those documents. We have to understand the Constitution ourselves. We cannot complain that we're losing it if you cannot say what those words means. If you can't go to your city councilman and say, if you were doing your job, here's what, you know, would be the right thing to do. You don't know. You're just asking them based on, you know, the latest headline. What's the latest emotional response we're getting to what, you know, our favorite talking head told us to feel. When we learn those words and we can advocate for them, and then we move that by the hundreds and thousands, we will see miracles. It's nature's law. This is the founders talked about that. The laws of nature will take effect based on our knowledge. My people are lost for lack of knowledge,
Yeah.
Isaiah says.
A couple times now you've mentioned going to your city council and articulating specific things from our state constitution. I love it. I've told the conservative base many times, what is a more effective argument? Going up to Capitol Hill, boo-hoo, we don't like this. You think those people in those sitting in those seats of power care about your boo-hoo? I'm sorry, but they don't. But when you make when you say Article 1, Clause 25, whatever, when you get up there and you articulate specific things and you say you took an oath and you are bound by oath or an affirmation to this.
It means a lot more.
That is a lot more powerful argument.
And I would take it a step even further, because we fall into this trap when we're so mad that we want to call every politician a tyrant and a communist, right? And some of them absolutely are, right? And probably a majority of them. But give someone the benefit of the doubt, especially at the local level. This is kind of why I mentioned city councils, but you know, I'd rather see good people getting into city councils and then taking action themselves. But change the mindset of having to call someone a tyrant and demand they obey their oath. That's not the point.
Get excited about it and say, oh, hey, did you know that the state constitution actually says this?
Well, appeal to their ambition of the city councilman wanting to say no to the governor, or the ambition of the legislator wanting to say no to whoever else it is where they feel pressured. When you say, here's what the Constitution says, and you kind of advocate for it, they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. You are giving them their power against somebody else. You say, hey, we're in this together. You represent me. We're in this together. Here's where the Constitution says this. The voice of the people is spoken. The voice of the people is behind you. And so start from a position of giving them power. I assume people in office don't understand it, and because they don't. So it's our job to teach them, but we better know our stuff. And they will appreciate it when we really know our stuff.
Always come back and tie it in with the Constitution, because that is the solution.
Totally.
Legislation is maintenance work, and it is important, but it's maintenance. It is such a flawed belief to think we're going to legislate our way out of this mess. It
Right.
is empowering the people by educating them on the Constitution,
Right.
both state and federal Constitution. And, well, I really appreciate both your time. It's been a very elaborate and informative conversation. And the takeaway that I want our audience to remember, and you're going to hear me mention this a few times, that when reading the 5,000-Year Leap, I saw Cleon Skousen differentiate liberty from freedom. He said freedom plus morality equals liberty. But I had this epiphany where I said, okay, so Cleon Skousen is differentiating liberty as something greater. And he's saying this is a required component to it. By morality, I'd say principles. But he's still not explaining what liberty is. So if it's different, what is liberty? We are given the ability to be free agents. But when we use that gift to be a free agent and we pursue a path of principles, true and proper principles, we further empower ourselves. So I ask people, hey, who couldn't use more empowerment in their life? Liberty is not just about politics. Don't you think it'd be nice to have more empowerment in your life? When you learn to better self-govern, these things are going to help us in every aspect of life, and you're growing your own power as an individual, and that is liberty, when we use our freedom to pursue principles. And so thank you so much, Cari and Enoch, and thank you so much for tuning in.